Commander Jake Morrison stood at the entrance of the ancient facility and felt his heart beat faster in his chest. The structure was buried deep beneath the red sands of planet Kelros 7, and nobody knew it existed until 3 days ago when mining teams detected strange energy readings coming from underground. Now Jake and his team of 6 soldiers moved through corridors that glowed with soft blue light. The walls were made of crystal and metal, fused together in ways that human technology could not replicate. Jake touched one wall and felt it hum under his palm like it was alive. Lieutenant Amy Holden walked beside him with her weapon ready and her eyes scanning every shadow. She had been with Jake for 5 years and trusted his instincts, but even she seemed nervous about this place. The air smelled wrong and tasted like copper on their tongues. Behind them walked 4 more soldiers, all young and all trying to hide their fear. They had found strange markings on the walls earlier, and Beth Harper, their science officer, said the symbols were at least 10,000 years old. That meant whoever built this place was here long before humans ever left Earth. The deeper they went, the stronger the energy readings became until their equipment started to malfunction. Jake ordered them to switch to backup systems and continue forward. They reached a massive chamber and stopped in awe. The room was enormous, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness above them. In the center stood 2 large containers made of the same crystal material as the walls. Both containers glowed with white light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Jake approached slowly and saw something that made him freeze. Inside the first container was a woman. She floated in some kind of liquid and her eyes were closed, but Jake could see she was breathing. Her skin was pale like moonlight, and her ears came to elegant points at the tips. Long silver hair drifted around her face, and when Jake looked closer, he saw she wore armor that seemed to be made from darkness itself. Beth came up beside him and scanned the container with her portable device. The readings made no sense, and she shook her head in confusion. The woman inside was alive, but her biology was completely unlike anything in their databases. Amy moved to the second container and called out to Jake. He joined her and looked inside at the creature that rested there. It was massive, even curled up inside the crystal prison scales covered its body, and they shimmered with colors that shifted. Between blue and silver and purple wings were folded against its sides, and a long tail wrapped around its body. The head was fierce with horns that curved back from its skull and teeth that looked like they could tear through starship hull plating. Beth checked her scanner again, and her hands shook. This creature registered as a living being, but its DNA was impossible. It was a dragon, and dragons did not exist. Jake stared at both containers and made a decision that would change everything. He turned to his team and told them they were going to open the containers. Amy protested immediately and reminded him that Earth Command had ordered them only to investigate and report back. Opening unknown alien stasis chambers could be dangerous or could release something hostile. Jake understood her concerns, but something deep inside him said this was right. He had learned to trust that feeling over years of command. The woman inside looked peaceful, but he could see pain in the lines of her face, even while she slept. Nobody deserved to be trapped like this. For who knows how many centuries Beth found the control panel after searching the chamber for 20 minutes. The symbols were alien, but some of them resembled mathematical formulas that she recognized. She worked carefully and slowly decoded the release sequence. Jake stood ready with Amy and the other soldiers positioned around the room with weapons aimed at the containers. If something went wrong, they would have seconds to react. Beth activated the sequence, and the containers began to glow brighter. The liquid inside started to drain away, and the crystal walls became transparent, then faded completely. The woman fell forward, and Jake caught her before she hit the ground. She was light in his arms and cold like she had been frozen. Her eyes opened, and Jake found himself staring into violet pupils that seemed to contain galaxies. She looked at him with confusion, then recognition, then something like gratitude. She spoke in a language Jake did not understand, but the words sounded like music. Then she touched his forehead with 2 fingers, and suddenly Jake could understand her. She said her name was Seraphine and she was Velkari. Her people had been hunted by an empire called the Dominion. They wanted her to reveal where her homeworld was hidden, but she refused. So they trapped her here in stasis to interrogate her later. That was 3,000 years ago. Jake helped her stand, and she was taller than him by several inches. She looked at the dragon container and called out a name, Nethys. The dragon container opened, and the massive creature rose to its feet. It shook its wings and stretched its neck, and the soldiers backed away in fear, but the dragon did not attack. It walked to Seraphine and lowered its enormous head. She placed her hand on its snout and smiled. The bond between them was clear. They were companions. Suddenly, alarms began to sound throughout the facility. The ancient systems had detected the release and were activating defense protocols. Beth shouted that they had maybe 5 minutes before the whole structure collapsed. Or worse, Jake told everyone to run. They sprinted back through the corridors, but the facility was fighting them now. Walls shifted and doorways sealed and crystal spikes shot up from the floor. Seraphine moved with grace that seemed impossible. She dodged every trap and pulled Jake along with her. Nethys flew above them, and his wings barely fit in the narrow passages. He breathed out something that looked like purple fire, and it melted through blocked doorways. They reached the surface just as the facility began to crumble. The ground shook and sand poured into the collapsing structure below. Jake and his team ran to their transport ship with Seraphine and Nethys following close behind. They took off and watched from above as the entire area sank into the desert, leaving nothing but a crater. Jake turned to Seraphine and asked her what she would do now. She looked at him with those strange violet eyes and spoke words he would remember for 20 years. She said the Velkari did not forget debts. He had given her back her existence when he could have left her imprisoned forever. When darkness came, for his people she would return. Before Jake could ask what she meant, Seraphine and Nethys vanished. One moment they were standing in the ship cargo bay, and the next they were gone. Only a few scattered crystals on the floor proved they had been real. Amy stared at the empty space and asked Jake what they had just done. Jake did not have an answer. When they returned to base, he reported everything exactly as it happened. Earth Command was furious. They court-martialed him for disobeying orders and releasing unknown alien entities without authorization. But the trial was quiet, and the sentence was light. Someone high up wanted the whole incident buried and forgotten. Jake was discharged from military service and sent home to Earth. He tried to return to normal life, but he dreamed of violet eyes and whispered promises. 20 years passed, and Jake never spoke about what happened on Kelros 7. But he never forgot. And deep down, he knew that one day Seraphine would keep her word. 20 years had changed. Jake Morrison, in ways both visible and invisible. His hair had turned gray at the temples, and lines marked his face from decades of hard decisions. He worked now as a security consultant on Sentinel-9, which was one of Earth orbital defense stations that protected the home planet. The job was quieter than his old military command, but Jake preferred it that way. He trained young officers in combat tactics, and sometimes he told them stories about his service days. He never mentioned Kelros 7, or the woman with violet eyes, or the dragon that should not exist. Amy Holden had stayed in the military and risen through the ranks with determination and skill. She was now Captain Holden and ran security operations for the entire station. She and Jake worked together often, and their old friendship had only grown stronger over the years. Today, Amy came to find Jake in the training center where he was teaching hand-to-hand combat to a group of nervous recruits. She waited until the session ended, then pulled him aside with a serious expression on her face. She told him they needed to talk in private. They went to her office, and Amy sealed the door behind them. She activated a privacy field that would block any listening devices or surveillance. Then she showed Jake classified reports that made his blood run cold. Colonies at the edge of human space had gone silent over the past 6 months. Not just one or two, but dozens of them. Ships sent to investigate found empty settlements with no signs of struggle. It was like everyone had simply vanished. Some survivors had been found drifting in escape pods, and their stories were terrifying. They spoke of ships that appeared without warning, ships that were black as space itself and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. These shadow fleets attacked without demands or communication. They simply destroyed everything in their path. Jake asked Amy if she knew who was behind the attacks. She told him that military intelligence had finally identified the enemy. They were called the Dominion. The name sent a chill down Jake's spine. He remembered Seraphine speaking that word 20 years ago when she told him about her people. The Dominion had hunted the Velkari to near extinction. Now apparently they had turned their attention to humanity. Amy explained that the Dominion was not just another alien empire. They were ancient and powerful, and they believed all other species were contaminations that needed to be removed. Humanity had expanded too fast and too successfully across the galaxy. Now the Dominion considered them a threat. Admiral Kate Brennan had called an emergency meeting of all senior personnel, and Amy wanted Jake to attend. He protested that he was just a consultant and not part of the command structure anymore. Amy insisted and said his experience might be valuable. The meeting took place in the station main conference room. Dozens of officers crowded around a large holographic display that showed star maps with red zones marked across them. Each red zone was a system that had gone silent. Admiral Brennan stood at the head of the table. She was a woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. She began the briefing without preamble. The Dominion had begun a systematic extermination campaign against multiple species across the galaxy. Humanity was not the only target, but they were definitely on the list. Earth forces were advanced and well-trained, but the Dominion outnumbered them by factors of 10 to 1. Their technology included weapons that could tear apart planets and biological agents that could wipe out entire populations in days. Conventional warfare against such an enemy would be suicide. One officer asked if they could negotiate or find a diplomatic solution. Admiral Brennan shook her head. The Dominion did not negotiate. They did not want resources or territory. They wanted complete elimination of species they deemed imperfect. Another officer asked about alliances with other alien races. Surely humanity had friends who would help them fight. The admiral explained that most species were either already destroyed or in hiding. The few that remained were too weak or too far away to provide meaningful support. Earth was effectively alone. The meeting dissolved into arguments and desperate suggestions. Some wanted to evacuate Earth and scatter humanity across hidden colonies. Others wanted to build massive defense fleets and fight to the last ship. Jake sat quietly and listened to all of it. His mind kept returning to Seraphine's promise. When darkness comes for your people, I will return. That darkness was here now. After the meeting ended, Jake stood at an observation window and stared out at Earth below. The planet looked so peaceful from orbit, blue oceans and green continents and white clouds drifting in patterns. It was hard to believe that death was coming for everyone down there. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and wondered if Seraphine even remembered him. 20 years was a long time. Maybe she had forgotten her promise. Maybe she was dead. Maybe he had been foolish to ever believe in the word of an alien he met for only minutes. Then something impossible happened. Reality itself seemed to shimmer in front of the observation window, space twisted and bent like fabric being pulled. A tear opened in the darkness, and through it came a ship. The vessel was like nothing Jake had ever seen in 2 decades of watching human ship designs evolve. It had organic curves mixed with crystalline structures, Light pulsed through it like blood through veins. The ship was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Behind it, more ships appeared, dozens of them pouring through the tear in space. Each one was unique, but all shared that same blend of living technology and crystal architecture. Alarms began blaring throughout Sentinel-9. Officers scrambled to battle stations, weapons systems powered up, and shield generators activated. Admiral Brennan's voice came over the intercom demanding to know what was happening. Jake could not move. He stood frozen at the window and stared at the lead ship. Through its transparent bridge section, he could see a figure. Even across the vast distance of space, he recognized her pale skin and pointed ears and violet eyes that seemed to look directly at him. Seraphine had returned. Behind her ship, something massive moved through space. It was not a ship, but a living creature. Wings spread wider than any human vessel, scales that glowed with inner light. Nethys had grown enormous in 20 years. The dragon flew beside the Velkari fleet like a guardian spirit. Jake realized he was holding his breath. Amy arrived at his side with her weapon drawn and demanded to know if they were under attack. Jake shook his head slowly. He told her these were friends. Before Amy could ask what he meant, every communication channel on Sentinel-9 activated at once. A voice filled the station. It was Seraphine, and her words carried the weight of centuries. She said Jake Morrison's name and told him she had kept her promise. The darkness had come for humanity as it once came for her people. But this time humans would not face it alone. The Velkari had returned, and they had brought an army. Jake felt tears run down his face. He had waited 20 years for this moment without even knowing he was waiting. Now Seraphine was here, and humanity might actually have a chance. Admiral Brennan's voice came over the intercom again. She demanded that Jake Morrison report to the bridge immediately. He had explaining to do. Jake smiled and wiped his eyes. He turned to Amy and told her to come with him. They had a war to win. The arrival of the Velkari fleet threw Earth military leadership into chaos. Admiral Brennan ordered Jake to the bridge immediately, and her tone made clear she expected answers. Jake walked through corridors filled with running personnel and flashing alert lights. Amy stayed beside him and asked questions he could not yet answer. When they reached the bridge, every screen showed different angles of the Velkari ships. The vessels maintained position just outside weapons range. They had made no hostile moves, but their presence alone was enough to send Earth defenses to maximum alert. Admiral Brennan turned when Jake entered, and her expression was ice. She demanded to know why an alien fleet had just appeared in Earth orbit and why their commander knew his name. Jake took a deep breath and told her everything he explained about Kelros 7 20 years ago, about finding Seraphine and Nethys in stasis, about freeing them despite orders about the promise Seraphine made before she vanished. The bridge fell silent as he spoke. Officers stared at him like he had grown a second head. Admiral Brennan's face went through several shades of red. She told Jake that his actions 2 decades ago might have just doomed humanity. For all they knew, these aliens were working with the Dominion. Maybe this was a trap. Maybe Jake had led enemies straight to Earth before Jake could defend himself. A new voice filled the bridge. It was Seraphine, and she spoke in perfect English now. She said she understood Earth military concerns. She offered to come aboard Sentinel-9 alone to speak with their leaders. She would submit to any security measures they required. All she asked was the chance to explain why the Velkari had come. Admiral Brennan considered this for a long moment. Finally, she agreed, but set strict conditions. Seraphine could bring no weapons and no guards. She would be scanned and monitored constantly. Any sign of threat, and she would be detained immediately. Seraphine accepted without hesitation. An hour later, Jake stood in the station main docking bay. Marines surrounded him with weapons ready. Medical personnel waited with scanning equipment. Beth Harper had been called up from Earth specifically for this meeting. She was older now, with streaks of white in her dark hair. but her eyes still held that same scientific curiosity. When the Velkari shuttle docked, everyone tensed. The airlock opened and Seraphine stepped through. She looked exactly as Jake remembered. Time seemed to touch the Velkari differently than humans. Her silver hair fell past her shoulders, and her armor still appeared to be woven from shadows. But her violet eyes were warm when they found Jake. She smiled at him and said it was good to see him again. Jake found himself smiling back despite the rifles pointed at her. Marines escorted them to a secure conference room. Admiral Brennan waited there along with several other high-ranking officers. Lieutenant Commander Beth Harper set up her scanning equipment in one corner. Seraphine sat calmly while Beth ran every test imaginable. The results confused everyone. Seraphine biology was similar to human in some ways, but radically different in others. Her cells absorbed and stored energy in ways that should be impossible. Beth said it was almost like Seraphine could feed on electricity or heat or even light itself. One officer muttered that she was like a vampire. Seraphine heard this and laughed. She said the comparison was not entirely wrong. The Velkari could absorb energy from their environment when needed. It was how they survived in deep space for so long after the Dominion destroyed their worlds. But they did not need to feed on living beings. They were not monsters. Admiral Brennan cut through the tension with a direct question. Why had the Velkari come to Earth? Seraphine's expression turned serious. She explained that the Velkari were survivors of the Dominion First Great Purge. For 3,000 years they had hidden and rebuilt in secret. They learned that the Dominion was searching for something called Nexus coordinates. These were locations of ancient power sources left behind by a civilization that existed before even the Dominion. If the Dominion found all the Nexus sites, they would gain enough power to reshape reality itself. They would erase every species they considered imperfect from existence. One of these Nexus sites was hidden on Earth beneath the Pacific Ocean. Humanity had been living next to one of the galaxy's greatest power sources without knowing it. This was why the Dominion had suddenly turned their attention to human space. They had detected the Nexus signature. Beth interrupted and asked if Seraphine could prove any of this. Seraphine nodded and produced a small crystal from her belt. She placed it on the table and activated it. A holographic image appeared showing star maps and energy readings. The data was complex, but Beth's eyes went wide as she studied it. She confirmed that there were indeed massive energy readings coming from the Pacific readings that human scientists had detected but never understood. Admiral Brennan asked what the Velkari wanted from humanity. Seraphine said they offered an alliance. The Velkari possessed thousands of years of knowledge about fighting the Dominion. They understood Dominion weaknesses and tactics. Most importantly, they knew how to use Nexus energy as a weapon. In exchange, they asked only that humanity fight beside them. Together, they might actually win against the Dominion. Separately, they would both be destroyed. The Admiral was skeptical. She asked why humans should trust aliens who appeared out of nowhere. Seraphine looked at Jake and said, because 20 years ago, one human showed her people compassion. Jake Morrison freed her when he could have left her imprisoned. He asked for nothing in return. That act of kindness proved that humanity was worth saving. The Velkari had debated for years whether to reveal themselves. Jake's decision made them believe humans could be trusted. Admiral Brennan studied Jake for a long moment. Finally, she agreed to consider the alliance, but she wanted proof that the Velkari could actually help. Seraphine offered to begin training human forces immediately. She would teach them techniques that blended technology with mental discipline, ways to channel cosmic energy through will alone. Over the next week training began. Seraphine brought small groups of Velkari warriors to work with human soldiers. The training was intense and strange. Velkari taught meditation techniques alongside combat forms. They showed humans how to sense energy flows and manipulate them. Progress was slow, but some soldiers began to show results. Amy was one of the naturals. She could feel the energy after only 3 days of practice. But then disaster struck. A young soldier named Danny Chen was practicing with a Velkari warrior. The warrior was trying to show him how to absorb energy safely. Something went wrong. The Velkari lost control for just a moment. Danny collapsed and died instantly. His life force had been drained away. The station erupted in anger and fear. Soldiers demanded the Velkari leave immediately. Families of personnel called for blood. General Lynn Carter arrived from Earth and sided with the protesters. She said the Velkari were too dangerous. They claimed to be helpers, but they killed humans. Admiral Brennan was forced to call an emergency council. Jake attended and watched as the alliance fell apart. Officer after officer spoke against the Velkari. Only a few voices defended them. Jake knew he had to speak. He stood and the room fell silent. He said that 20 years ago he made a choice to free strangers. He did not calculate odds or hope for reward. He did it because it was right. Now those strangers were here offering humanity a chance. Maybe their only chance against the Dominion. Yes, the Velkari were different. Yes, they were dangerous, but so were humans. The question was not whether they trusted the Velkari perfectly. The question was whether humans were brave enough to fight alongside allies who were not like them. He reminded everyone that Danny's death was an accident. A tragic accident. During training. People died in military training all the time. That did not mean they stopped training. Jake said that if they sent the Velkari away, humanity would face the Dominion alone, and they would lose. Everyone on Earth would die. Was that preferable to the risk of working with aliens? His words hung in the air. Admiral Brennan called for a vote. The council was split almost evenly. But in the end, the alliance was maintained by a narrow margin. The Velkari could stay. Training would continue with additional safety measures. Jake felt exhausted after the meeting. He found Seraphine standing on an observation deck. She was watching Nethys fly lazy circles around the station. The dragon had grown so large that his wingtip to wingtip span was wider than most ships. Seraphine thanked Jake for speaking up. She said most humans would not risk so much for people they barely knew. Jake replied that most humans were better than she thought. They were just scared. Fear made people do foolish things. Seraphine agreed and said she knew fear well. The Velkari had lived with it for 3,000 years. Then she told Jake something that changed everything. Long-range sensors had detected the Dominion main fleet. They were 7 days away from Earth. The war was coming, whether humanity was ready or not. Jake looked at Earth hanging peacefully in space below 7 days, to prepare 7 days to unite humans and Velkari into a fighting force. 7 days to learn how to use ancient power sources. 7 days before everything changed forever. He turned to Seraphine and asked if they could win. She met his eyes and said honestly that she did not know, but they would try. And sometimes trying was enough. The Dominion arrived on the 7th day exactly as predicted. They did not announce themselves or make demands. One moment space was empty, and the next it was filled with ships. Thousands upon thousands of vessels emerged from dimensional tiers. They formed a wall of metal and energy that blocked out the stars. Human sensors struggled to count them all. The Dominion fleet was larger than anything humanity had ever imagined. Each ship was angular and dark, with weapons that glowed red like infected wounds. Admiral Brennan ordered all Earth forces to defensive positions. Human ships formed up alongside Velkari vessels. It was strange seeing the two fleets working together. Human ships were efficient and practical. Velkari ships were elegant and organic, but both were ready to fight. The Dominion attacked without warning, no communication, no ultimatum. They simply opened fire with weapons that tore through space itself. Human shields flared and died under the onslaught. Ships exploded in silent bursts of light. The battle for Earth had begun. Jake stood on the bridge of Sentinel-9 and watched the tactical displays. Red icons representing destroyed ships blinked out one after another. The defense fleet was taking heavy casualties, but they were also fighting back human railguns and missiles combined with Velkari energy weapons. They carved paths through the Dominion formation. Nethys flew through the battlefield like a comet. The massive dragon was too fast for Dominion targeting systems to track. His breath weapon melted through enemy hull armor. His claws ripped apart smaller ships. 3 Dominion vessels tried to box him in, but Nethys simply teleported away in a flash of light. He reappeared behind them and destroyed all 3 before they could react. On the surface of Earth, massive defense cannons fired upward. Their beams reached into orbit and struck Dominion ships, but the Dominion had weapons of their own. They launched pods toward Earth atmosphere. The pods contained biological agents designed to break down complex life. If they reached the surface, every living thing on the planet would die within hours. Amy led a squadron of fighters to intercept the pods. Her voice came over the communication channel calm and focused. She coordinated her pilots with precision. They destroyed pod after pod, but there were so many. Some got through, they entered atmosphere and began releasing their deadly payload. On the ground, emergency response teams activated containment. Protocols. Giant energy domes sealed off areas where the pods landed. It was not perfect, but it saved millions of lives. Meanwhile, Seraphine had other plans. She came to Jake on the bridge and told him they needed to reach the Pacific Nexus. If the Dominion seized it, Earth would lose any chance of victory. Admiral Brennan overheard and agreed immediately. She assigned Major Claire Rodriguez to pilot the insertion craft. Claire was one of the best pilots in Earth Fleet. She had survived combat missions that should have killed her a dozen times over. Jake and Seraphine gathered a mixed team of humans and Velkari. Beth Harper came along to study the Nexus 3. Velkari warriors joined them, including one named Lyra, who moved like water and fought like lightning. They launched from Sentinel-9 in a modified assault transport. Claire flew with skill that bordered on supernatural. She dodged Dominion fire and threaded between dying ships. Several enemy fighters pursued them. Nethys appeared out of nowhere and destroyed the pursuers with casual ease. The dragon escorted their ship down through atmosphere. They entered over the Pacific Ocean and dove toward the coordinates Seraphine provided. The water below looked peaceful. It was hard to believe something so powerful was hidden beneath those calm waves. Claire brought the ship down, and they transitioned to underwater mode. The transport sealed itself and dove deep. The pressure at this depth would crush normal vessels, but the transport had been reinforced with Velkari technology. They descended for what felt like hours. Finally, their lights illuminated something impossible. A structure sat on the ocean floor. It was enormous, and made of the same crystalline material Jake remembered from Kelros 7. The Nexus pulsed with inner light that turned the dark water bright. But they were not alone. Dominion forces had already breached the site. Enemy ships surrounded the structure. Troops in powered armor moved through the underwater facility. Claire found an opening and brought them in fast. They docked hard, and the team rushed out. The Nexus chamber was even more impressive than the facility on Kelros 7. Crystals, the size of buildings, hummed with power. Energy flowed through channels carved into the floor and walls. The air itself seemed to vibrate. Seraphine led them deeper into the complex. She moved with confidence, like she had been here before. Jake asked how she knew the layout. She explained that all Nexus sites shared similar designs. The ancient builders followed patterns. They reached the central chamber and found the Dominion forces waiting. At least 20 soldiers in heavy armor blocked their path. Behind them stood something that made Jake's blood turn cold. The hierarch was massive and seemed to be made of living shadow mixed with cold light. Its form kept shifting, like it could not quite hold shape in this reality. Eyes like burning stars stared at them with alien intelligence. The hierarch spoke in a voice that bypassed ears and spoke directly to minds. It said humanity was contamination. The Velkari were failures that should have been erased long ago. It would purify this world and add its power to the Dominion collection. Then reality itself would bend to Dominion will. Seraphine stepped forward, and her voice was steel. She said the Dominion had tried to erase her people before, and failed. They would fail again. The battle that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced. Physics seemed optional in the Nexus chamber. Velkhari warriors moved with impossible speed. They drew energy from the Nexus itself and used it as both shield and weapon. Lyra danced through Dominion soldiers, and her hands trailed light that cut through armor. The human soldiers fought with determination and adaptability. Claire used her pistol to create covering fire. Beth stayed back and studied the Nexus controls. She was searching for a way to use its power. The Hierarch engaged Seraphine directly. They fought in 3 dimensions. Sometimes they were on the floor. Sometimes they walked on walls or ceiling. Energy blasts tore through the chamber. Jake fired his rifle at Dominion soldiers. He took cover behind crystal formations. An enemy soldier charged him, and Jake switched to hand combat. The training Seraphine had given him kicked in. He could feel energy flowing through the room. For the first time, he managed to channel some of it. His punch hit the Dominion soldier with force that should have been impossible. The soldier armor cracked and it flew backward. Jake stared at his hand in shock. Then 3 more enemies attacked, and he had no time to think. He fought on instinct. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Seraphine was being overwhelmed. The Hierarch was too strong. It pinned her against a wall with bands of dark energy. Nethys tried to help, but Dominion soldiers had brought heavy weapons. They fired nets of energy that tangled the dragon. He roared and thrashed, but could not break free. Jake saw Seraphine struggling. He saw his team falling back. They were losing. He made a decision. Jake ran toward the Nexus core. Beth shouted at him to stop. Touching the core directly would kill him. No human could survive that much energy. Jake did not care. He reached out and placed both hands on the crystal surface. Power slammed into him like a tidal wave. It burned through every nerve. His vision went white. Somewhere far away he heard Seraphine screaming his name, but Jake held on. He thought about humanity, about Earth hanging vulnerable in space, about all the people who would die if they failed here. He thought about Amy leading her pilots, about Claire fighting beside him, about Beth searching for answers, about every human who deserved a future. The Nexus responded to his will, not through absorption like the Velkhari, but through sheer stubborn human determination. Jake became a conduit. Energy poured through him and into the chamber. It washed over his team and gave them strength. Seraphine broke free from the Hierarch grasp. Nethys shattered his bindings. The Velkhari warriors moved faster. The human soldiers fought harder. Together, they pushed back the Dominion forces. The Hierarch realized it was losing and tried to flee, but Seraphine caught it. She channeled Nexus energy through her body. Her hands blazed with purple fire. She struck the Hierarch with everything she had. The creature exploded into fragments of shadow that dissolved into nothing. The remaining Dominion forces retreated. Jake fell to his knees, still holding the Nexus core. Seraphine rushed to him. She tried to pull his hands away, but he would not let go. The Nexus was becoming unstable. All the energy they had drawn from it was causing feedback. It was going to explode. The blast would destroy everything for hundreds of miles, including Earth coastal cities. Seraphine made a decision. She placed her hands over Jake. She began absorbing the excess energy into herself. But it was too much even for her. Jake saw what she was doing and refused to let her sacrifice herself alone. He held her hands together. They channeled the Nexus energy, human will and Velkhari discipline working as one. Slowly, the core stabilized. The wild energy calmed. The threat of explosion faded. Finally, Jake and Seraphine collapsed together. The last thing Jake saw before darkness took him was Beth and Claire rushing over and far above through hundreds of feet of water and miles of atmosphere. The tide of battle was turning human, and Velkhari forces had felt the Nexus pulse. It had given them hope. They fought with renewed strength. The Dominion fleet began to break apart. Admiral Brennan led a desperate assault. Her flagship dove straight toward the Dominion command ship. It was a suicide run, but it worked. The command ship exploded. The Dominion formation fell into chaos. They retreated back through dimensional tiers Earth had survived, but the cost was terrible. Thousands of ships destroyed, hundreds of thousands dead, and Jake Morrison unconscious deep beneath the Pacific. Nobody knew if he would ever wake up. 3 months after the battle, Jake finally opened his eyes. He was in a medical facility, but it looked different from any hospital he knew. Human equipment sat beside Velkhari healing crystals. Doctors and nurses of both species worked together. Jake tried to sit up and found his body responded sluggishly. A human nurse named Linda rushed over and told him to stay still. He had been unconscious for 12 weeks. His body had absorbed more energy than should have been survivable. Human and Velkhari doctors had worked around the clock to keep him alive. Jake asked about Seraphine. Linda smiled and said she was fine. She had recovered weeks ago. In fact, she visited Jake every single day. Sometimes she sat beside his bed for hours. Linda left to get a doctor, and Jake stared at the ceiling. Memories of the battle flooded back, the Nexus chamber, the hierarch touching the core. He should be dead. He remembered pain beyond description, but he also remembered something else. When he and Seraphine held hands while channeling the Nexus. Their minds had touched. He had experienced fragments of her memories. The fall of the Velkhari civilization, cities burning in purple fire, her people fleeing into the dark between stars, centuries of hiding and fear, the loneliness of being one of the last survivors. She had experienced his memories too. Growing up on Earth, joining the military, the decision to free her on Kelros 7. His love for humanity, chaotic creativity, his guilt over past failures, his stubborn hope that tomorrow could be better. They had shared something profound, a connection deeper than words. The door opened and Seraphine entered. She stopped when she saw Jake was awake. For a moment they just stared at each other. Then she crossed the room in 3 quick steps and embraced him. Jake hugged her back and felt tears on both their faces. She pulled away and smiled. She said she had been worried humans were fragile compared to Velkhari. She feared the Nexus energy had damaged him beyond repair. But here he was, awake and aware, and still stubbornly alive. Jake asked what happened after he passed out. Seraphine sat on the edge of his bed and told him everything. The Dominion fleet had retreated, but not surrendered. They would return eventually, but Earth had bought time. Precious time to prepare. The alliance between humans and Velkhari had deepened after the battle. Shared sacrifice created bonds that could not be broken. Memorial services honored the dead of both species. Their names were carved into monuments together. Velkhari and human engineers were working side by side now. They combined technologies in ways neither could achieve alone. Medical science had advanced by centuries. The healing techniques that saved Jake were proof of that training facilities had been established. On Earth, young humans and Velkhari learned together. Amy had been promoted to admiral after her heroism in the battle. She now commanded Earth orbital defense. Claire had received medals for her piloting. Beth had become the leading expert on Nexus technology. Jake listened to all of this with mixed emotions. He was proud of how far humanity had come, but he worried about what came next. The Dominion would not give up. They would return with greater force. Seraphine seemed to read his thoughts. She said there was something else, something she needed to show him. She helped Jake out of bed. His legs were weak, but Velkhari medical technology had kept his muscles from atrophy. They walked slowly through the facility. Other patients stared at Jake. He was famous now. The human who touched a Nexus and lived. The man who helped turn the tide of battle. They took a transport to a Velkhari ship in orbit. The ship interior was beautiful. Organic curves and crystal lights, everything hummed with quiet energy. Seraphine led him to an observation deck. Through the windows, Jake could see Earth below, but he also saw something new. Structures were being built in orbit, massive stations that blended human and Velkari design. Seraphine explained that these were training centers, places where both species could learn to use Nexus energy safely. She said it was time to reveal the truth. The real gift she had promised. When Jake freed her 20 years ago, she vowed to help humanity. She had kept that promise by bringing the Velkari fleet. But that was not the astonishing gift. The real gift was knowledge. The Velkari had studied Nexus sites for 3,000 years. They discovered something incredible. The Nexus machines were not weapons. They were catalysts for evolution. Tools designed to help species transcend their limitations. To take the next step in development, humans, it turned out, had unique neural structures. Their brains were naturally suited to channel Nexus energy, more so than even the Velkari. With proper training, humanity could become something unprecedented, a species that bridged physical and energy-based existence. They could innovate with science while manipulating cosmic forces. They could build with their hands while shaping reality with their minds. This was why the Dominion feared them. Not because humans were strong now, but because of what they could become. Seraphine said the Velkari would teach humanity everything they knew, all their knowledge, all their techniques, thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. This was the gift. The chance to evolve beyond current limits. Jake absorbed this information slowly. It was overwhelming. He asked what the cost would be. Seraphine's expression turned serious. She said the gift came with a terrible price. By accepting this knowledge, humanity would become a permanent target. The Dominion would never stop hunting them. Earth would never know true peace again. Every generation would face war. The choice had to be humanity's decision alone. The Velkari would not force this path on anyone. Jake thought about this for a long time. Finally, he said that choice should be made by people smarter than him, by elected leaders, by all of humanity together. Seraphine agreed and said the vote was happening today. That was why she brought him here, to watch screens activated, showing broadcasts from Earth. Every city and town and settlement, billions of people gathered to hear the announcement. Admiral Amy Holden stood at a podium. Behind her were representatives from every Earth nation. Beside them stood Velkari leaders, including Seraphine, second in command. Amy spoke clearly and without hesitation. She explained the gift, the opportunity, the cost. She said humanity had always reached for the stars. They never chose easy paths. When obstacles appeared, they found ways around them. When enemies threatened, they stood and fought. This choice was no different. They could remain as they were, safe but limited, or they could accept the gift, grow beyond their current form, face endless war, but also endless possibility. Amy called for the vote. Results came in from across the planet. It was not even close. Humanity voted overwhelmingly to accept the gift. They chose growth over safety, possibility over peace. Jake was not surprised. That was humanity nature, stubborn and hopeful and always reaching higher. Seraphine smiled when she saw the results. She said she knew they would choose this way. That was why she believed in them. Jake and Seraphine left the observation deck and went to the training facility. It was enormous. Thousands of students already filled the halls, humans and Velkari learning side by side. Jake saw young people practicing energy manipulation. Others studied ancient texts. Some worked with Nexus fragments, learning to channel power safely. On a practice field outside, he saw something that made him laugh. Nethys was there. The massive dragon had become a teacher. Smaller dragons flew around him. They were offspring he had sired using Earth genetic engineering, Velkari DNA mixed with Earth reptile genetics. The results were beautiful. Young dragons of every color soared through the sky. Human and Velkari students flew with them. Learning aerial combat, Jake turned to Seraphine and asked what happened next. She looked at the students below, at the future taking shape before their eyes. She said now they prepared, the Dominion would return, but they would find something unexpected, a galaxy beginning to unite. Not through conquest, but through choice. Humanity had freed the Velkhari from prison. Now together they would free the galaxy from fear. Jake watched young soldiers training below human and Velkhari working as one. He thought about how far they had come. 20 years ago, he made a simple choice: free a stranger who needed help. He never imagined it would lead to this. Seraphine seemed to read his mind again. She said the greatest gifts often came from smallest acts of compassion. He freed one prisoner. Together they would free the entire galaxy. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He covered it with his own. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the future unfold. The sun set behind them, casting long shadows. But Jake did not fear the darkness. Not anymore, because he had learned something important. When you reach out to help others, when you choose compassion over fear, when you stand up for what is right, the universe reaches back. 20 years ago, Jake Morrison freed an alien woman from prison. Today, that woman stood beside him, her people and his united facing impossible odds. But facing them together, the Dominion would return, war would come again. There would be suffering and loss, but there would also be hope, and sometimes hope was enough. Jake looked at Seraphine and saw her smile. She looked at him and saw a friend, a partner. Someone who proved that different species could trust each other, could fight together, could build something better. The training facility below them hummed with life and energy. Young voices called out in excitement as they mastered new skills. Dragons roared and swooped through the sky. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and they would shape it together. Human and Velkhari side by side, building tomorrow, one choice at a time, just as it had always been, just as it would always be. The story did not end here, it was only beginning. But that was fine. Because the best stories never truly end, they just continue growing and changing like the people who live them, like humanity, like the Velkhari, like everyone brave enough to reach for something better. The stars waited above, full of danger, full of wonder, and humanity was ready, not because they were perfect, but because they never stopped trying. That was the real gift. Not power, not knowledge, but the courage to keep moving forward, no matter what came next. And as Jake stood there watching the sunset with his friend beside him, he knew they would be okay. Not because victory was certain, but because they would face whatever came together.